Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations with artists, writers, and curators. My name is Mike Sakazugawa, and this is episode 88. Today's guest is Jennifer Greenburg. Hello, welcome to the show. Today on the show, I'm talking with photographer Jennifer Greenburg. Jennifer Greenburg is an associate professor of photography at Indiana University Northwest. She holds a BFA from the School of Art Institute of Chicago and an MFA from the University of Chicago. Solo exhibitions of her work have been held at the Hyde Park Art Center, the Print Center, and many other places. Greenburg's work has been included in numerous national and international group exhibitions. Lightwork awarded her an Artist in Residency in 2005. Her work is part of the permanent collections of Lightwork, the Museum of Contemporary Photography, the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, and the Museum of Photographic Arts. Jennifer Greenburg's monograph, The Rockabillys, was published by the Center for American Places in 2009. I first became aware of Jennifer's work a few years ago when her series Revising History went viral, and that's the series that we talked about in our conversation. I had a chance to see Jennifer give an artist talk at JDC Fine Art here in San Diego at the opening of her exhibition Cultural Grooming. That show will be up through May 31st, 2019, by the way, so if you're in the area, do check it out. Anyway, so that show features a number of images from Revising History, which is a series in which Jennifer takes vintage vernacular photos, that is, found snapshots, mostly from the 1940s through the 1960s, and then she inserts herself into the photograph, replacing the central figure of the image with herself in the same pose and styled the same way. The result is seamless to the point where if you didn't know, like perhaps if you only saw one of these images by itself instead of the whole series, you might think that it was just an old snapshot. But the idea here is that by doing this, by inserting herself into these old photographs, she's able to use those photographs to comment on the way that our memory and mental image of these past times, and especially the style and glamour of old photographs, how that simplifies and erases the struggles women faced in those times. Here I'll read a section of her artist statement for the series. She says, quote, "The captivating aesthetic present in post-war American photography encourages us to believe that it was a time of civility when it was actually a time of discrimination and gender inequality. A woman's future, both personally and professionally, was usually determined by her beauty and her presentation, rather than her skills or qualifications. Yet, the visuals of the post-war era act as a mask, covering up and glossing over a past that is more convenient to forget using aesthetic appeal. I utilize those visuals to draw my audience into a conversation about the narrative we have scripted regarding the American past. By presenting portraits that are transmuted from their original intention, I foster a conversation about how historical depictions of women are used to help us idealize our past. I intend the series to engage the audience in a conversation about the way we interpret the media, record personal memories, and establish a collective history," unquote. I've put a link in the show notes to Jennifer's website where you can see these images as well as images from some of her other bodies of work. I highly recommend checking those out. And in particular, I'll also note that the titles of each image adds a lot of context and information about the image, so be sure to read those as well. Now, in addition to the exhibition at JDC, if you're going to be in or near Sydney, Australia in the near future, Jennifer has an exhibition of Revising History up through May 19th, 2019 as part of the Head On Photo Festival. There's a link in the show notes with all the details, so do check that out. Okay, let's get started. As always, if you'd like to join in the conversation, you can use the hashtag #ChannelOpenPhoto on Twitter for your comments and questions. And now here's my conversation with Jennifer Greenburg. You know, I said this to you when we met at JDC, that I've been aware of and been a fan of your work for some time now. I was sort of going back and trying to figure out, I always do this when I talk to somebody, try to figure out when I first became sort of acquainted with their work. Mm-hmm. And I think that it was either 2014 or maybe 2016 that sort of around both of those times, I think your work had won some award or something and was going around a lot, and I'd see it a lot. So I think it would have been one of those times. But yeah,
Yeah.
I've known about it for at least, a few years, and I've always found it really interesting. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Well, I appreciate your invitation. I'm very flattered and I'm excited. And yeah, I think most likely it was 2014 and it could have been something that I was awarded, but I think what really happened is that I was featured in Wired magazine and the work went absolutely viral.
Hmm.
And that was a crazy experience. I sort of wish it happened now, partially because I think my work has really evolved and gotten better in this amount of time. But also, it's funny because I was talking to my students yesterday. I'm a professor at Indiana University Northwest, which is located in Gary, Indiana, although I live in Chicago. And I have, the most fantastic students, and we have unbelievable conversations. And yesterday we were talking about, work going viral and just different artists that this has happened to and how strange things get said to you basically as an artist throughout your career.
Hmm.
And they said, did you get any offers to become like an Instagram influencer or did you get any like free products in the mail? And I was like, damn, I was a few years too early.
Just a bit,
Like
yeah.
if I had gotten viral this year, I probably could be like a famous Instagrammer and get like all kinds of weird things shipped to me and like I could take pictures of them and make a whole bunch of money. So yeah, suddenly I was disappointed.
That whole experience is so. I've had a sort of strange brush with virality as well, and for me, it wasn't even something related to my work, which I kind of wish it had been. Maybe that would have been a little more fulfilling, but it's such a strange thing because I mean, there are people out there who are trying to generate things for the purpose of going viral, but most of the time when it happens sort of organically, it's almost like a necessity that it happens unexpectedly. And I feel like you go through this process of like, what is happening?
Yeah. And, when it happened to me, because I think it was 2014, that was really a long time. I mean, it's 5 years ago is like a lifetime ago in terms of the evolution of social media and the evolution of all these networks and platforms and whatever. I don't even know that I had Instagram in 2014, but I wasn't aware that this had happened to anyone else.
Mm.
And I had no idea what was happening. And I was totally unprepared on how to respond and totally unprepared. And I was getting unsolicited advice from people that was not good advice. I was getting really strange emails. I mean, just the strangeness of the emails. And I would say that I just froze more than anything. And it's interesting because I was updating my mailing list the other day and I don't know even how I was doing this, but I came across an email that somebody from a publication had sent me. And I think that in the haste, I was just declining everything. I was like, no, thank you, no, thank you, no, thank you. And that was really to my, detrimental. I should have been more open and I should have like gotten somebody on board who knew what they were doing to help me, or I'm not sure, but I just cringed when I found this email from this publication. I think what had happened is that I had Googled the publication and I had gotten wrong information and I thought it was like a ultra conservative right wing publication that I wasn't interested in. And I declined it and I know what it is now and I'm just like horrified. So
yeah,
because I'm a yes person. I'm a hustler. Everything that's happened to me has been through my own heft. I'm really not good with making connections and asking people for help or asking people for consideration. I should be. I think I've made terrible career mistakes because I don't take better advantage of my connections because I never want to impose. I never want to ask for anything. So I end up like I work really hard. I work 7 days a week. I'm a hustler. And to decline anything is like sort of against my nature. But again, I was getting really bad advice, unsolicited advice from people who are not really knowledgeable and who I'm sure don't have my best interest at heart. So whatever.
Yeah. It is at the very least an overwhelming experience. That's for sure. When it happened to me, it was very overwhelming. But let's talk about your work, this work that did go viral. So the title of this series is Revising History, and these are vintage vernacular photographs that you are putting yourself into, which I find that a really fascinating thing. One of the things that I was thinking about as I was sort of thinking about, what might we talk about, was the title of the series itself, Revising History. Mm-hmm. So like as a writer, like, 'cause I'm a photographer and a writer, and when I think about the word revising, I'm usually thinking about a way in which we, as artists, go back and take something and try and change it to make it better. Mm-hmm. And certainly that's even what we talk about, like revisionist history is like a way of making history sound better. But, and even though what you're doing here with these images is literally like you are changing the images and they are historical images, I feel like what you're doing isn't exactly revising in that sense of making something better, but almost the opposite. Like what you're trying to do is sort of expose the ways in which history is not better, or possibly what you could be doing is revising the present. And I sort of wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, revisionist history is sort of what we're doing right now, especially now more than ever, now more than when I began the project. As a photographer, I think that this is pretty alarming. The faith that people put in the photographs that we've left behind of the past in order to tell us something that we need to know, or we would like to know, or we would like to forget, is pretty complicated. And I think a lot of things that I'm witnessing I'm just taken aback. I teach photography. I think about photography. I'm ensconced in photography. I'm a child bride of photography. And I am perfectly aware that every photograph that's ever been taken has been taken from the vantage point and the perspective. And I don't mean the physical perspective. I mean like the mental perspective of the person who took the picture. That person includes and omits information. And we're looking at a result that's through the lens of that person's experience and through the lens of that person's biases and through their agenda. And photography's progenitors like Jacob Riis and Louis Hine, they did incredible things for the society that we live in right now by establishing child labor laws, by establishing housing laws, by, working on human rights. And those are really important things, but those images are no more honest than any other image. They just align with most of the things that we all think are true. And I have found myself for my entire life looking at photographs of beautiful women who were wearing beautiful clothing from the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, and some in the 1970s. And I find myself creating this narrative about what her life was like, and that how her life must be so much better than mine because she went to fancy parties and she had beautiful clothing and she had perfect hair. And what did she have to concern herself with? And I'm a knowledgeable person. I'm a visually literate person. And yet I still do that today. I have vernacular photographs all over my house. And I look at them and I start to just idealize the things that I see. And so I understand what you're asking with the photographs, but I think, at least from my perspective, like when I pick an image that I'm going to work on, there's an initial grab to that picture that takes me off into another dimension and to another fantasy that couldn't possibly be real about how glorious that moment must have been, even when there's things like sexual objectification and all these different tropes that I'm commenting on. There's something about the aesthetics that punch at you first, because the things that you see are the first things that you sort of receive. And then the message, the concept, the context, all these things are what you arrive at, I think, after you've sort of sat with the image for a while. So that's the sort of line. I'm probably not even answering your question. That's sort of the, that's where I am. And so, even like one of the photographs that I just finished at the last stroke of 2018, which is called She Made Sure to Tell Me to Keep Smiling, which is a photograph of a woman posing in front of a group of men. There's one woman there and she has her hand on her head and she's really sort of in a seductive pose. And all of these people are clearly evaluating her. When I saw that image, the first thing I thought of is, oh, she's gorgeous and glamorous, and what a moment. And no wonder that they're all just admiring her. And of course, that's not what's happening in the photograph, but it's very easy to just sort of gloss over what she must have been feeling, what the circumstances must have been, and all that stuff. So, I mean, I think your take is 100% valid. It's something for me to think about, but I sort of see it as like a push and a pull, a symbiotic relationship between revising the past and maybe pointing out that things are worse in the past. And so I think that the aesthetics is where I sort of live in that tension, I think. 'Cause to me, something beautiful is I'm always going to see the beauty first and then think about how horrible it is second, which is, I guess, my own shortcoming.
Well, I mean, to be fair, I think a lot of us we all have our sort of initial gut reactions to things that are often very immediate and emotional. But, then the question is, are we willing to look sort of deeper than that? And it seems like that's certainly what you're attempting to do here is to look deeper than that. Something that you said that I thought was really interesting. When you're referencing historic photographers like Lewis Hine, for example, and talking about what came out of those photographs in sort of like a material, even political kind of way, right?
Yeah.
And yet those, as you say, and of course this is completely correct to say that the photographs are no more true than any other photographs. All photographs, of course, lie, or at least edit the truth.
Sure.
There's a thing that you said in a previous interview. I have it written down here. It's you did an interview with Photo Eye in 2017, where you were talking about something similar. Because you were talking about how you started off doing documentary photography, and yet you became sort of disillusioned with that. And the particular thing that I thought was really interesting, the sentence that you said, was pictures convince us of truth more than words, which I feel like really bears on this thing that you're talking about, the way that we, as audience members, engage with pictures in a different way than words. But what I'm kind of interested in considering somebody like Lewis Hine, or or your work, or really anybody's work in a certain way, like I wonder if there's a different way to approach these things, if this is something that is innate, or whether we could train ourselves to do something differently. Because what I'm always interested in with art is what the art actually does, like what its function is. And when it comes to something like words, which is something as a writer I do think about these things, how stories are such a powerful and ancient form of teaching people things, of engaging with the world as it is, or as it was, or as it should be. And so in that sense, like Hine's photographs, the story of them is in many ways maybe more important than the factualness of them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you know what I mean?
Well, yes. And he chose the most wretched children that he found to photograph, and the most innocent and the youngest looking. And that was very smart, because he needed to tell the story. And when you tell a story, you don't tell everyone every little detail, right? You tell them the basics, you give them the baseline. And so choosing kids that didn't look too bad and didn't look too hungry and who hadn't lost fingers or whatever, that wouldn't have helped his proposition, which is that we needed to change the laws, because he felt that, Americans would not grow up to be citizens if we used them up as children, that they needed to be able to develop and grow so that they could be citizens, so that our country could move forward. And this is a very important idea, and one that I think few people would not agree with. And so because we agree with it, we are fine to sign on to what he did. We're like, oh yeah, that's the way you tell the story. You tell the story by showing the things that will resonate with people the most, that are the clearest, that, outline the details in the most representational way. But at the same time, we have to remember that that's still inherently problematic, because we didn't get the full information, and we never get the full story in any newspaper, in any story. We never get the full picture. And that is what it is. But I don't know what's happening. But for some reason, as a society, we're like not identifying that. Like we're never looking at something and saying, okay, well, this is one thing, one side of the story. What's the other side? What's the other way? People just sign on to things 100% at this point and charge into a burning building without knowing anything about the fire, I guess. And so this is the kind of thing that, I mean, it's unnerving. It's scary. It's frightening. It's all kinds of things, you know?
I guess. I mean, I mean, taking somebody like Louis Hine obviously was working a long time ago. I have this suspicion that more people are willing to interrogate photos now than might have been back then. But even then,
sure.
You know, if I think about things that, you know, works of art that had sort of material effects in the world, like taking somebody like John Steinbeck and The Grapes of Wrath also had a really profound impact on how we talked about the Dust Bowl migrants and the economic situation of the Depression and things like that.
Sure.
And I wonder, like, if, I mean, like, legitimately, I'm not like trying to make a rhetorical point by asking this as a question. Like, I actually wonder, do we, or did we, or do we still consider things like literature and how it also is telling a story that is very slanted and directional? Would we consider that differently from something like what Louis Hine is doing? And like, what is that difference, you know?
Well, the difference is that those literary works are presented as fictions, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's pretty interesting. Now I go down these rabbit holes because I'm also a rabid reader. I'm sort of like, we were talking informally that I think during my talk at JDC, but also just today, how I would consider myself sort of a compulsive person in any of the things that I'm interested in. So one of my other compulsions is like reading. So I go down these rabbit holes of looking at one subject and reading every single thing on the topic. And so I was on this kick that I was sort of looking at women in the sort of Parisian explosion of culture that, you know, happened around the 1900, 1910, 1920 that, you know, included all these interesting people. And so I went on this Zelda Fitzgerald, like down this rabbit hole, which ended up leading me to read all types of accounts about Ernest Hemingway and Martha Gilmore. And, you know, all of these books are based on non-fictional people who lived in history, but they're historical fictions because you can't really know what Ernest Hemingway and Martha Gilmore were like speaking about in real life, but they're being presented, you know, those books are published as fictions. And I think with books, I think that distinction is like pretty clear. Like when you're reading something that's historical fiction or historical nonfiction or just a fictional account based on a series of pieces of information that were sort of loosely based on the truth, like those things get disclosed. Whereas like photography, and I don't know if it's because of the egos and the personalities of most people who take pictures, we don't really get that. Like nobody ever really identifies that. Like if I think of like Bruce Davidson's photographs that he took like in Harlem, if you listened, I don't know, have you ever seen that documentary about him talking about that work?
I haven't seen it, but I've heard people talking about it.
Yeah. And he proposes those pictures as though, you know, he went there every day and took pictures of all those people. And he says, I wanted to be fair. I wanted to show the good and the bad. And I think he was very fair, but I don't know that he ever acknowledges his outsiderness in that work. Like, I don't know that he ever acknowledges like that it's still just his perspective and he's not an insider. And he obviously was trusted by some, but not trusted by others. There's a very interesting sort of subtext about the way that all the women in that project look and are looking at him. And, you know, I don't think we ever we don't cop to it enough, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I get what you're saying. I do think there's a way that people interface with photographs in a way that's less sort of aware and sophisticated about the difference between the object or the representation and the subject, even
Indeed.
As compared with, because I mean, not all books are fiction, right? I mean, we have narrative nonfiction and memoir
Sure.
and stuff like that. It does seem people are a little more willing to understand, like if we read, I don't know, Michelle Obama's recent memoir, like we're understanding that it's a story that's being told from her perspective that is going to be influenced by that perhaps to a greater degree than we might a photograph.
Sure. And, you know, you want to talk about the origins of the difference between those two things. There's a big, easy to explain reason for it. And it's that we grow up reading books in school and having those books be part of a classroom dialogue. We start reading books in first grade. I mean, the minute we start learning to read, we start to learn how to interpret text. I mean, that's like the first thing we do is start to read stories and start to discuss what those stories mean. And yet visual literacy and stories being told in pictures is never covered at any level unless you seek it out.
Yeah.
And yet at this point in the 21st century, we're seeing many more images than we are reading books, I think. And yet we are a culture that's essentially visually illiterate. And so it's kind of like if we were, you know, we're just looking at things and taking them as they are because no one has ever taught us to decode these things. I teach, like I said, in Indiana, and Indiana is a state that has pretty much removed arts education from middle school and high school. And I don't know about primary school, but I think maybe there's a change. But like when I first started teaching there, many of my students had never taken an art class before. And I remember I pulled up Seurat's painting, you know, Sunday in the Park with George, famous pointillist painting. It's owned by the Art Institute Museum here in Chicago. So it's a painting that most people have seen who live in Chicago. And we started to talk about how that painting is not just a painting of people sitting by a lake, that it's, you know, it has this whole subtext about the haves and the have-nots and the potential alludement to the women being prostitutes and like all, you know, this basically this class war happening along this lake of the people in the shadows and the people in the highlights. And this one student of mine started crying. She literally started crying, tears rolling down her face, because the idea that a picture meant more than it just looked by just looking at it was totally an overwhelming concept because she had never heard this before. And she had thought the painting was beautiful. And that was all she really knew about it. And just this idea that it's so much more than you think it is. And she had never, you know, just the betrayal of having never had this information, presented to her was just totally overwhelming. And that's, I think, the most meaningful time that's happened, because I just felt so sad and there was something so painful in the way that she was upset. But I've had that happen many times throughout my career there, is that somebody just becomes totally overwhelmed because they feel betrayed that this has not been presented to them in the past. And, you know, it's to me, it's just an emergency. I mean, it's an emergency that this gets solved. So.
Yeah. Something else that I think about, which bears on your work, I think, well, I mean, I know it does because this is something that you sort of talk about, but there's this way in which I think, to compare, again, writing and photography, I think people are aware of the artifice of writing to a greater degree than they are of photographs. And that sort of gets to what I was referring to, is that because you're working with vernacular photographs, and a lot of your, you know, what you do with these photographs and what you talk about when you talk about them has to do with the ways in which these photographs are all very similar to each other, and like how people use them in a way that isn't like, these weren't photographs that were made to make an artistic point or intended to make that point. Whether or not they make a point anyway is an interesting question, but like they weren't intended as that kind of thing. And so like the way that we use the photographs in our lives is very different from how we would use, you know, writing, even fairly mundane, sort of maybe diaristic kind of writing is still, it's more obviously a product of artifice than we think of with photographs that we tend to interface with as a recording, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm really interested in this way that, you know, you're using vernacular photographs to do these things. And in particular, there's so many things about the use of vernacular photographs that's interesting. about your work. One of the things that I was sort of thinking about recently is when you spoke at JDC, and you've talked about this in other interviews as well, is you talked about how all vernacular pictures look the same. And obviously it's not like exactly the same, but there's these very common visual tropes, and the compositions are often very similar. I think a lot of people who use vernacular images in their work have made a similar kind of observation. Mm-hmm. Like I'm thinking of like Penelope Umbrico or Eric William Carroll. I don't know if you know his work. Have made sort of similar observations, and all three of you have sort of gone in different directions with that. What I find really interesting to me is that the thing that occurs to me all the time, and I'm always struck by, is there's something compelling about the tension between the uniqueness of an actual life or moment and the sort of banality of that moment's document in a photograph. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I kind of feel like more than most other people who are commenting on that banality, your work kind of like lives in that tension more, At least I feel like it does. How do you feel about
that? Tension meaning I'm totally picking up what you're putting down. I just want to make sure that I don't go on a crazy tangent.
I guess I'm just saying, like, it's not exactly that what you're doing with these photographs is talking about how they're all exactly the same, in a way that, like, Penelope Umbrico's sunset photographs are all like literally like you put them all together and they all are the same, right?
Yeah.
What you're doing is a little different from that. And I feel like it's engaged a little bit more with that disparity between the visual part of it being very similar, and even there's something about, here's what it is. There's something I think about this idea, even in life, that, the photograph reminds us that the rhythms of so many of our lives are very much the same. And yet we are all individuals, and there's something that we want, like there's a certain anxiety about the fact that, when we think like my life is exactly the same as everybody else's life, that might have a certain anxiety to it.
Yeah.
And it's both true and not true. And I feel like that paradox is something that your work is, I don't know if it's directly addressing it or just sort of brushing up against it, but there's like that element to it. And that is something I find very fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what I am thinking, I mean, you're making me think about this in a slightly different way, I think, which is why I'm sort of just taking it all in. But, what I sort of think about, I don't know if two people's lives are the same as each other's. I have no idea. I have no way of knowing that. I am personally kind of an outlier in general. Like I don't fit into, I'm just, anybody who knows me kind of knows this. Like I'm, loud and funny and strange and probably a lot of other things that I don't want to think about, but I don't really like, I don't have a normal human life for a variety of different reasons. And so I only see how different and separated and other I am seemingly from everyone else, and how everybody else seems to have very different goals than I have. And that's a place I've lived my whole life. I remember feeling that way when I was just a little kid. I remember just looking around and being like, I don't know what I'm going to do. This is not going to work for me. None of what any of these other kids are doing is going to work for me. And, that causes you to make all kinds of strange decisions, which I would say my life has been a series of strange decisions. So that's probably not something that I can comment on. But what I can comment on is how when it's your birthday or when it's your wedding day or when you graduate from school, you take the same photograph of that moment. And there's a visual convention that takes place among everyone. And that if something happens in your life that you associate with a benchmark or a notable enough time that you're going to take the picture, that you take that picture in an identical way as someone who's like you've never met before, who's living a totally different life, who has a totally different existence. It doesn't matter what your economic level is. It doesn't matter what your race is. It doesn't matter what your gender is. You're going to take that photograph in the exact same way. And that is totally fascinating to me, because I have photographs of Jewish people and photographs of Black people and photographs of Asian people and photographs of people who had nothing and people who seemed to have everything. And yet the graduation picture, the birthday picture, the child's 5th birthday picture, these are all taken in the same way. And that blows me away. That just is something that I think this is less remarkable to think about if you include personal images that are posted on social media and the like personal journal via the photograph that gets posted on social media. Like, I don't mean like journalism, like as in the news media photograph. I mean like the personal journal as played out in images. I'm not sure what the word is for that, but
diaristic maybe? Yeah,
diaristic photographs that we see. Like, so this becomes less remarkable because now all we can do, like, it's almost like you can't go on a vacation and you can't have a birthday unless you've posted about it on social media. But if you figure before there was this ability to share pictures, nobody in Portland, Oregon would see photographs taken in upstate New York. Like, there's no way that there's any communication between those two things. And the distribution of personal photographs was almost non-existent in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s. I mean, this is a time when photographs weren't shared. And yet somehow there's a system to these pictures that gets duplicated again and again and again. And so I don't know about the lives, but I just know about the record of the life seems to be awfully similar.
Like, I thought of like 10 things that were really interesting about that, but I think we have to take the break now and then do the second segment.
Oh, really? Okay.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which can be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever might be on your mind. What would you like to talk about today?
I think that we should talk about vintage clothing.
Okay. Let's do it.
My other obsessive passion in life.
So let's do it. Where would you like to start?
Yeah, well, so it's hard for me, in these moments not to talk about sort of the things that relate to my work, but because like I mentioned in the previous segment, I have this very strange singular life. But something a lot of people don't know about revising history is that the pictures are made using my entire body, the physicality and the performance and the transitioning to the person who I think is supposed to be in the pictures is really, truly the hardest part of making the work. And another part of that is styling myself and using this extensive wardrobe of vintage clothing that I've been collecting for more years than I would like to disclose because I wouldn't want to give away anything about my age. But, I started collecting, when I was I think when I was 6 or 7, I had some allowance money burning a hot hole in my pocket. And there was an estate sale across the street from where I grew up, which was ironically in the Wrigley Mansion in Chicago, which is, I know it's funny. I grew up in a small apartment, but I grew up across the street from the Wrigley Mansion. Chicago's a weird place. And I bought this giant Elizabeth Taylor style rhinestone cocktail ring that came in a celluloid velvet lined box. And I bought a beautiful pair of magenta and amethyst chandelier earrings set in brass. And I remember my parents were like, there's an entire room of toys in this house. Are you sure you wouldn't rather have the toys? And I was like, no, I'm pretty sure. I'll go look at the toys. And there was one doll that had like these long limbs. It was like very weird. And she was basically dressed up as like a drunk hooker in a flapper outfit. And she had she had blue eyeshadow on and like one eye open. And I was like, okay, well, I also have to have this doll. So I bought the chandelier earrings, the Elizabeth Taylor ring, and the hooker doll. And I was like, I'm good. Let's go. And basically that story is like all you need to know. I've not changed. I'm the same person. And something that I wonder, I hope I still have that doll. I think I still have it because it's just so weird. And it's just like, who made this and why? Later on, in about 94, 93, something like that, let's back up even more. So, I had this love of like these vintage clothes and vintage accessories and like the glamour of beautiful women. And I was never really interested in toys. I was mostly interested in like Barbie because she had fancy outfits, and like I was obsessed with the Bob Mackie collection that he designed for Barbie. So I was, she had her own car, she had her own apartment. Like this was on my level when I was a kid. The other things that little girls were playing with, just didn't seem interesting to me. But when I got to be old enough to be given a roll of tokens and told to take the green limousine, which is in Chicago speak, taking the bus to get where you wanted to go using the tokens, I started to, meet friends that were sort of not from my school, because Chicago is a pretty, huge city, and you get, I was like a vintage, interested in vintage clothing, interested in punk rock, interested in goth. So I started meeting people who were not people from my school. And I made really good friends with a bunch of, cross-dressing drag queen people who are slightly older than me, and they really got along with me well. And so they would take me out, and we would go thrifting, and we would go to an underage juice bar in Chicago called Medusa's and dance to music and wear stupid clothes and just, have a really good time. And so through that experience, I ended up meeting a really important artist named Greer Langton. I don't know if you've heard of her before. Mm-hmm. She was like in the Whitney Biennial, and she was this famous doll maker. And she made these like very subversive kind of dolls that were just very creepy and also very funny at the same time. And she had lived in New York for most of her life. She was actually Nan Goldin's friend. So she's actually in a lot of Nan Goldin's photographs. And so we were friends like the last 2 years of her life. She moved back to Chicago because she was very, very, very ill. And so she was here to be kind of closer to her family and everything. So it's interesting because that hooker doll really looks like something that Greer Langton had made, but it isn't. But so that's sort of my origin story with all of this. And so I still collect vintage clothing. I spend an incredible amount of time tracking these things down, and I'm sort of in this whole network of people that are literally all over the world who buy, sell, and trade vintage clothes. And so that's sort of another aspect of my life that I'm really passionate about. And I have the funniest experiences regarding the purveying of vintage clothes, because especially now they're very hard to come by, and they require a lot of care, and they require a lot of, maintenance. And, just today, I got up, I was at school really late helping students who are presenting their thesis exhibition, and everything's going great. I was so exhausted. And I woke up this morning, I was like, I really need to just like kind of relax for a second and chill and like get my head together. I'm being interviewed this afternoon on this podcast. And I was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start revitalizing this piece of vintage clothing. I'm going to soak it. I'm going to sew up some seams. I'm going to like really get this thing perfect. And so that's what I did all morning, just to like kind of relax, which I know must sound crazy, but
we've all got our things though, right?
Yeah. And so I have this like special room in my house that's like my laboratory that's filled with all these like different chemicals that you can use to, get stains out of fabrics and soak things. And so this is like another part of my artistic practice that, I don't have an opportunity to ever talk about, which is this like extensive repair system that is constantly going on. And it's totally satisfying. Like,
yeah. It almost, the way you're talking about it reminds me of, like I got to go to the center at the University of Arizona where they have all the different photographic archives there, and got to talk to the, hear a presentation by the conservators there, the different photo conservators. The way that you are talking about working with these vintage clothing is very similar to how they were talking about preserving and restoring historic prints. It's very, and their, different negative archives and things like that. It's very interesting.
Yeah. And, I always laugh because, of course, I went to college and to graduate school when there was no digital photography. And so I'm, trained as a master printer. And I did, all my own darkroom work until there was no reason to do darkroom work anymore. And I would say that, I partially have a degree in chemistry that I am not using anymore. I don't have, I have absolutely no use for that knowledge. And so I always joke because right now I'm using my extensive knowledge of chemistry to get stains and smells out of vintage clothing and to preserve vintage items and also to bleach my own hair so that I can be perfect for my photographs. And that's the extent of that entire breadth of knowledge, but it's okay. It's working for me.
I think it's really interesting. So I was in high school in the 90s, sort of in the mid 90s. And I feel like that was exactly the moment when vintage clothing sort of went from being something that only weird people would wear to being sort of more mainstream. I remember it happening. And, cause in the 80s, nobody was wearing, everybody was trying to be on the cutting edge and everything, brand new flashy kind of thing. But then sometime in the mid 90s, people sort of started becoming more interested in vintage everything. I remember going to thrift stores and trying to dress myself like I was from the 60s. And the different ways that would manifest itself. And what I find really interesting about that whole thing is how I didn't realize it at the time because obviously I was a kid and I was right in the middle of it, but how it seems like the whole culture did this shift from where in the 80s, everybody trying to look towards and reach towards the future to in the 90s, all of a sudden, everybody becoming exceptionally nostalgic and the whole culture becoming nostalgic. And we haven't really gotten away from that. It seems like there's this constant, for, 20, almost 30 years now, people have this real backwards looking sort of ethos. I don't know. I feel like there's something profound there,
Sure. And, that's where my work is born from, that concern. Everybody does want to look to the past and you think to yourself, well, why is that? Well, they used to have, if you could say one thing positive, the clothes and the style was impeccable. It just was. And clothes were tailored to fit people, and getting your clothes made for you or getting them altered to fit your body was not something that was reserved for the rich. That was something that everyone could access. And, clothes were made in America by some person who was not sleeping under their, there's a time when, of course, all of our clothes were made by slave labor in this country, but there was a golden moment in there when a dress shop had full-time employees that worked 40 hours or whatever and made you your clothes.
My grandma worked in one.
Yes. My great grandmother was one of those people. Right. And, I'm not glossing over the hardships that she suffered or that your grandmother suffered, but, those clothes were beautiful and those clothes looked good on everyone because they were made for that person. And maybe you only had two dresses, every couple of years, and you wore those two dresses all the time, but those two dresses were impeccable and they were designed for you and they were custom made to you. And so it's hard not to look at that and be longing and be envious. And the construct that you could only afford two dresses and that if it got a rip, you had to mend it because you didn't have money to replace it. These things get lost, only the end product, because the end product is in the photographs. And unfortunately now everything you can buy in a store that's new, even if you're shopping in the most expensive stores, most of it's made in China. It's not made of great material. It's not going to last. The zippers are cheap plastic. The quality is just not the same. And certainly the fit is not the same. The ready to wear, especially, I don't know, women's clothes is, I think, different in men's. Men's clothing has a lot more uniformity. Like if the pants say they're a 32-inch waist, they are a 32-inch waist. Whereas if I were to go into a store, even if I were going to go into a shopping mall, and I were to grab like a size 6 from 10 different manufacturers, the measurements of those items are going to be wildly different from each other because there's no consistency. And so it's very hard to find things that fit. Things are, it's just chaos, I think. And so I think that's part of it. And, in the 90s, I would say to me in the 80s, there was a lot of people wearing vintage clothing. Like if I think about the icons like Cyndi Lauper or Madonna, who were just, my version of Jesus, they were wearing vintage clothes. They were blending it with modern clothes, but like the crinolines and the short jackets and all that lingerie and stuff, that was all vintage. And, there was a desire to mark yourself as different from sort of the capitalists of the 1980s excess culture, right? So the people who are wearing the cashmere sweaters and the plaid skirts and who are very preppy, who are buying new things, fancy things, they wanted to be very different. So they were, essentially going to wear sexy garbage in order to set up their artistic point of view. But yeah, in the 90s, that's when we stopped making things in the United States, and that's when things started to not fit so well. And that's when, clothing got kind of just beige and dumpy and horrible. And I think that's part of why people get into this idea that they're going to look backwards. And I get it, but I also think it's something we need to talk about.
Yeah. One of the things that I find so ironic about it is that, like, when I think of, like in the 90s, really even through today, the whole Mad Men thing is fairly recent still. Like a lot of times we're looking back towards the 1960s and to some degree the 1950s. But then also nowadays there's a lot of nostalgia for 80s fashion. And when I think about those eras, like the 1950s, 60s, and 80s are all, like, as you say, there were definitely, it's not that nostalgia didn't exist then or vintage clothing or any of these things didn't exist at those times, but I just feel like the sort of overriding the zeitgeist of those moments was very like in the 50s and 60s, everything was like focused on like the space age and rockets and like, you see it in a lot of the sort of industrial design of the time and people had this sense of forward progress and everybody was looking forward. And in the 80s, I feel like it was a little more ironic perhaps, but like when I think about like 80s new wave fashion or like, I don't know, like when U2 was doing their Zooropa thing, like everybody, like there was this just way of like people were almost like trying to make science fiction out of themselves in a way.
Yeah, sure.
And so, but these eras that we're now looking back to eras that were themselves looking forward, there's something really sort of weirdly ironic about that whole, that phenomenon. I don't know. But,
yeah. And and then what I also think about when you bring this up is I don't know how we're supposed to have any new ideas when we're so inundated with old ideas. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I think that, the 90s is the birth of like the 100 channels on television. And before that we had 3 or 4, whatever it was. And we're just, the 24-hour news channel got born in the 90s, and we are inundated with information all day long. And I don't know how you can be an individual that, we've always just been a product of influence, right? But the influence now is so behemoth that it like extinguishes any kind of like independent thought because we're just being influenced like every second of every day. And yeah, we're not coming up with interesting fashion ideas anymore. We're just replaying the old ones because how can anyone think in this environment? I think. I don't know.
I think, when I think about what I was thinking about as a teenager in the 90s, and particularly as someone who was just sort of coming into my own as a person consuming culture and like deciding what music I liked and things like that. What I remember of that time was that I and all of my peers were very obsessed with this idea of realness, like of things being sort of like earthy and real. And like, I feel like that, I'm by no means the first person to make the observation that 90s music and the sort of Seattle sound was this very intentional response to the sort of glitziness and excess of the 80s and trying to sort of I mean, a lot of people will talk about how like in the 70s music influenced that music, but that we were reaching for something more tangible, I guess. And I think what's interesting about the idea that by looking backwards, we can't come up with new ideas. I do feel that, but at the same time, like when I think about now, what I think about now is that we are, at least I and the people that are around me, are talking about and reevaluating, like we're spending so much time looking at the past that it's given us an opportunity to recontextualize and discuss these old ideas in ways that we maybe should have at the time, right? Like, I mean, I feel like this really bears on your work, because your work in many ways is forcing us to take this surface glamour and try and actually reckon with what that felt like at the time, right? And to see beneath it. We didn't do that back then, but I feel like we are doing that now, or at least we're starting to. So, like, I feel like there's a hopefulness in that.
Oh, absolutely. And, we are making positive strides and accepting things like we have never accepted them before, exactly as you say. And by no means am I casting I feel it's funny because when I finished talking a minute ago, I was like, oh, you're being so negative, but, meaning me, I'm being so negative, but, that is absolutely the upshot. I mean, we're becoming more aware of our past and accepting it. I mean, I have a lot of examples, that I don't think would be probably appropriate to, disclose in a public forum, but no, I have people around me who used to have different attitudes about the American past than they have now. They have taken a step back and taken a more honest approach at identifying who we used to be and what we used to think is acceptable, and are moving forward in an exceptionally positive way. And that would be something that if you had asked me 10 years ago, did I think that was possible? I would have said no. And so, I mean, there's amazing things, but, we, in the last couple of years, there's been this huge death toll among these progenitors of artistic expression. Just this week, a great Chicago blues singer named Andre Williams died. And I knew Andre Williams pretty well. And I mean, if you look at his body of work, I mean, he is an individual. He was a crazy, wild guy who had crazy wildness and originality in his blood. And I mean, he was if you any of your listeners look it up, you're going to come across a song named Jailbait, and you're probably going to be really offended by that song. And that is what it is. It was a different time when he recorded that. But, if I think about the people who have done things that I am in awe of, Screaming Jay Hawkins, another amazing artist, who is a singer and just one of the weirder people that's ever performed in front of an audience. How do you get to be that person in 1930? This with, he would come out with horns in his nose, and he would come out with a cape on and be a Dracula kind of figure, and do all these performative, very unusual things. And, he invented that character pretty much in a vacuum, because he didn't have Facebook and he didn't have Instagram, and he wasn't being influenced constantly by images and whatever. And so as a result, he's born of this totally strange set of underpinnings to his creativity. And that's just what I'm worried about, is that we can't really evolve sort of without this constant barrage of influence. And as artists is what I'm more thinking of. And so I don't know what that means for us, but we're in the culture of appropriation. I mean, all we're doing is taking ideas and appropriating them, and I'm fine with that. That's what I do. So, I mean, who am I to judge? I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I have at times, also sort of bemoaned our sort of sequel culture. Everything is a remix, everything is a reboot, reimagining. But I don't know. I find room to be both pessimistic and optimistic at the same time.
Sure. Yeah. And isn't that postmodern in and of itself? Right?
Oh, that's great. That's funny. So there's one question that I usually like to close with.
Okay.
And that is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
I'm at a loss because for a couple reasons. One is because I hate prioritizing. Like, I never want to make a list of like my favorite things and have one be my favorite rather than number two.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I can't. Like, I don't know if you use Lightroom at all, but like there's a rating system in Lightroom where you take images and you can give them like a 1 to 5 star rating.
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea what the difference between a 3-star and a 4-star image would be. Like, everything to me is either amazing or horrible.
Yeah.
I would say that that's how I see the world. And so in terms of like art that I see and experience and think is amazing, I am just, there's so much. And I'm trying to think recently. Okay. All right. Fine. Got it. Okay. So this past Saturday in Los Angeles at the Hayworth Theater, and I saw the Bob Baker marionettes perform. I don't know if you're familiar.
I'm not.
I wasn't either. And so the reason I was there was because Angeline, who is a Los Angeles celebrity, I don't know if you know who she is. Do you know who she is? No. Oh my God, Oh my God, Mike, we got to talk about Angeline.
I can be surprisingly ignorant about a lot of things, but
No. If you have never lived in Los Angeles, I don't know how you would know who she is. I have never lived in Los Angeles, but I feel that it's my job in life to know about all unusual blonde women who drive hot pink cars and look like Barbie. So it's like sort of one of my goals in life is to just know who all these people are. But so Angeline is a local Los Angeles celebrity of sorts who is not famous for anything. She has blonde hair. She drives a hot pink Corvette that's made in a very specific shade. It's always a brand new car. So every 2 years it gets like a new Corvette with the brand new, with the same color pink. And in the 80s, all of these billboards went up all over Los Angeles that had this very iconic picture of her with these very 1980s, like amazing sunglasses on she's wearing like the satin Fredericks of Hollywood, like tight pants and cha-cha heels. And it just says like Angeline. And there was no real record that came with it. There was no like burlesque show or strip show. I mean, she's not famous for being anything. She's just famous for being Angeline. And nobody knows who paid for these billboards. And she drives around Los Angeles and she'll pull over and you can buy like hats and t-shirts that are $85 a piece, by the way. And you can pay her assistant to have a photograph taken with her. And there's a really unusual, very avant-garde documentary about Angeline that you can watch I'm sure it's on YouTube at this point. And there's a lot of information. You can Google her, Angeline, spelled with a Y, and look at all kinds of unusual pictures. There's like constantly people in Los Angeles like tracking where she is. And so Angeline was going to be performing with the Bob Baker marionette troupe in this theater in downtown Los Angeles. And so I like freaked out and I was like, oh my God, we have to go see Angeline because she's not really a performer. She has like a single that's called Kiss Me LA, and she has had like a very few amount of things, but basically, like I said, she's famous for nothing. She's like a performance artist of nothing. And so she doesn't really perform. And so I was totally curious as to what this was going to be, because like, what is she going to do? Cause she's not used to talking or singing or doing anything. So we get to this theater and the MC host is a performer from Los Angeles named Mystic Kidder. And you can like Google, look on Instagram, Mystic Kidder. And Mystic Kidder is in a phoenix costume, like the bird, with like a giant paper mache head with sunglasses and giant earrings. And Mystic Kidder is also kind of a marionette operator because the mouth of the bird moves and everything. And so he was kind of like an MC of like a drag show or like a burlesque performance. So he's very like, subversive and had like really funny jokes and everything. And so then he would like say something, and then Angeline came out, and the extent of her performance was she was laying on her back on a reclining couch with her legs up in the air, kicking her feet with a fan in front of her face. And then she kind of wiggled around on the stage for a few minutes, and that was it. And then Mr. Kidder would say something, and then the marionettes would come out and do these amazing dances. And like in the lexicon of like dolls and marionettes, the costumes are like absolutely exquisite, and they're weird, and they're just mesmerizing, like just totally mesmerizing. And it was a great night. It was one of the weirder things you could possibly see, but I totally enjoyed every second of it, and I was blown away, and I loved it.
Great. Wow, that sounds fantastic.
Yeah. It's very out there, but very me at the same time. So yeah, everyone should look up Angeline, look up the Bob Barker marionette, and look up Mystic Kidder. I promise you'll have a great hour on the internet looking up those three things.
Outstanding. Well, thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for talking with me. I really had a good time.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, so once again, for SoCal listeners, Jennifer's show Cultural Grooming is up at JDC Fine Art through May 31st, 2019, and her exhibition at the Head On Photo Festival in Sydney, Australia is up through May 19th, 2019. There are links to both in the show notes, so do check those out if you can. And that is our show. If you'd like to get in touch, you can follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at ChannelOpenPod, on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechannelopen, or you can send an email to podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can find our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/sakeriver. That's sake like the drink and river like river. Another thing you can do to help out the show and put a smile on my face is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. We'll be back on May 22nd with a conversation with writer Julia Dixon Evans, so do be sure to come back for that one. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.